The royal city was bustling with activity, as it always was. The streets were filled with merchants shouting their latest deals, children laughing as they played, and travelers from distant lands stopping to admire the grand architecture. At the heart of this city stood the royal palace, a towering symbol of power, wealth, and order. The royal guards, dressed in gleaming armor and standing tall in their disciplined formations, were always a sight to behold. They were the proud protectors of the monarchy, ensuring peace and stability in the kingdom. Their presence was a reminder that no one was above the law. But in the shadows, a different story was unfolding. For months, the city had been on edge, with rumors circulating about a fugitive who had been on the run for a long time. This man had been wanted for his numerous crimes, which ranged from theft to more violent acts. His name had become synonymous with fear, and whispers of his deeds spread through every corner of the kingdom. The royal authorities had searched high and low for him, but he was elusive, always one step ahead. The city's citizens lived in constant worry, never knowing when or where he would strike next. The fugitive had managed to keep his distance, avoiding the royal guards at every turn. His reputation had preceded him, and his ability to evade capture had earned him the respect of those who feared him. However, on this particular day, something changed. It was early in the afternoon, and the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the bustling streets. People were going about their daily routines, oblivious to the danger that was lurking nearby. As fate would have it, the fugitive found himself in the very heart of the city. He had been moving through the crowds, carefully keeping to the shadows, when he was spotted by one of the royal guards. The guard, who had been patrolling the area, immediately recognized the fugitive from the wanted posters. His heart raced as he realized the fugitive was within his reach. But this wasn't just any guard. He was one of the best, known for his sharp instincts and unwavering duty. The guard's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword as he stepped forward, signaling to the fugitive to stop. For a brief moment, the crowd seemed to pause. The sounds of the market faded as all eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. The fugitive's calm demeanor was almost eerie. He didn't seem surprised, nor did he panic. Instead, he remained perfectly still, calculating his next move. The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd knew that something big was about to happen. The fugitive's fingers twitched under his coat. In one swift motion, he pulled out a gun and aimed it directly at the royal guard. The shock of the moment rippled through the onlookers. People froze, unsure of what to do. Some instinctively backed away, while others tried to get a closer look. The royal guard, though momentarily taken aback, stood tall and focused, never once lowering his guard. His training had prepared him for moments like this, but that didn't mean it was any less dangerous. The standoff had begun, and neither side was willing to make the first move. With every passing second, the tension grew. The entire street was now silent, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The fugitive's gaze was cold and unwavering, while the guard's eyes were sharp and calculating. Everyone was waiting for something, anything, to break the deadlock. The moment of truth had arrived. The streets were eerily silent as the standoff between the fugitive and the royal guard unfolded. People who had been going about their business only moments before were now frozen in place, their eyes fixed on the dramatic scene before them. The fugitive, his face hard with determination, had his gun trained on the royal guard. His finger rested on the trigger, but his stance remained controlled. The weapon in his hand was a symbol of power in that moment, but it was also a desperate plea, a last attempt to escape from the law that had chased him for so long. The royal guard, standing tall in his polished armor, was the picture of calm. His hand, though close to the hilt of his sword, didn't move. He didn't reach for it. Instead, his focus remained solely on the fugitive. His eyes, steady and unblinking, studied the man in front of him. He knew that every second that passed brought the situation closer to a dangerous breaking point. Yet he wasn't about to act rashly. His training as a guard had taught him to assess, to think before acting, even in the most tense of moments. A bead of sweat trickled down the royal guard's face, but he wiped it away quickly. His breathing was steady, his mind racing as he calculated the best course of action. He wasn't afraid, but he understood the gravity of the situation. The fugitive in front of him had been marked as dangerous for a reason. His reputation was known across the kingdom, and this standoff was not just about the two of them. It was a symbol of a much larger battle between law and chaos. In the distance, a few of the nearby guards noticed the commotion and began to make their way toward the scene, their steps quick and purposeful. But the royal guard knew better than to expect immediate help. This confrontation was his alone for now. He couldn't afford to wait for backup. He had to deal with the situation himself. He had been trained for these kinds of moments, but even the best training couldn't prepare him for the pressure of facing a wanted fugitive with a gun. The fugitive's hand twitched slightly as if considering something. He was clearly calculating his next move, weighing his options. The gun in his hand was a powerful tool, but it wasn't invincible. He knew that once he pulled the trigger, there was no turning back. The consequences would be immediate, and it was unclear whether he could escape or if he would meet his end right there in the middle of the crowded street. Yet, his desperation pushed him to the brink. He had nothing left to lose. The city had become a cage, and this moment, with all its tension, was his final stand. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, the fugitive's gaze cold and calculating, while the guard's was steady and unyielding. Neither spoke, the silence between them growing heavier by the second. It was a strange kind of standoff, not just between two men, but between two ideologies. The fugitive, desperate for freedom at any cost, and the royal guard, bound by duty and law, standing firm against chaos. The crowd held its breath. Everyone watched, waiting for the first move. Would the fugitive make the first move? Would the guard draw his sword? The world seemed to pause, each person there feeling the weight of what could happen next. The suspense was unbearable, and the question on everyone's mind remained. What would happen in this critical moment? Would the fugitive make a deadly decision, or would the royal guard find a way to prevent the bloodshed from escalating? The tension in the air was so thick it felt as though time itself had slowed. Every eye in the crowd was locked on the fugitive and the royal guard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The fugitive's grip on the gun tightened, but his hand didn't waver. His breathing was shallow, as though every inhale and exhale were a fight. The royal guard stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him, but his mind was racing. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. The whole city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. The fugitive wasn't just holding the gun. He was holding on to the last shred of his freedom. Every choice he made now could be his last. The pressure was mounting, and the royal guard could see the conflict within the fugitive's eyes. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a man on the edge, a man who had nowhere left to run. It was as if every move, every second of this standoff, was leading to one critical choice. Would he pull the trigger, or would he find another way out of this desperate situation? For the guard, the standoff was more than just a confrontation with a criminal. It was a test of resolve. He had trained for this moment for years. He knew the importance of staying calm under pressure, of thinking with a clear mind. But even with all his training, even with the knowledge that he was capable of handling this situation, the guard knew that there was no certainty in what would happen next. Everything depended on the fugitive's next move. The silence was almost deafening. The only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant chatter of the marketplace, and the steady, controlled breathing of the royal guard. His heart beat loudly in his chest, but he kept his composure. He had seen enough dangerous situations to know that hesitation could be deadly. He had to be ready for anything. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. His hand stayed near his sword, but he did not draw it. If he moved too quickly, if he made the wrong choice, the fugitive could act first. The crowd was eerily still, their eyes wide with fear, unsure whether to intervene or run. Some of the more brave souls edged closer, trying to catch a glimpse of the standoff. But no one dared to make a sound. It was as though they all knew that whatever happened next would change the course of the day. The streets had gone from lively and busy to quiet and tense in an instant. People were afraid, not just of the fugitive, but of the unknown outcome that hung in the air. The Royal Guard's thoughts flickered back to his training, to the countless drills he had gone through to prepare for moments like this. But no amount of practice could prepare him for the reality of staring down a fugitive who had nothing left to lose. The guard wasn't just facing a criminal. He was facing someone who had already crossed a line, someone who might be willing to do anything to avoid capture. The guard knew that every word, every action from this point forward, could either resolve the situation peacefully or escalate it into something far worse. The fugitive's eyes darted from the guard to the crowd and back again. He seemed to be searching for something, a way out, perhaps, or a sign that he could still escape. His finger remained on the trigger, but the tension in his hand began to ease. The slightest hesitation was enough to make the guard's heart race. Was the fugitive considering surrendering? Or was he merely playing for time, preparing to act when the guard least expected it? The moment was hanging by a thread, and the crowd, too, was on edge, unsure of how the story would unfold. Just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, something unexpected happened. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't another guard, nor was it someone from the marketplace. It was a royal officer, someone who seemed to carry an air of authority that commanded attention. The officer wasn't wearing the usual heavy armor of the royal guards, but instead a simple uniform that still reflected his high rank. His presence alone seemed to shift the energy in the air, drawing the attention of both the fugitive and the royal guard. The officer's voice rang out, calm and measured, breaking the silence that had held the street captive. "Lower your weapon," he said, his tone firm yet soothing. His eyes locked onto the fugitive, not with anger, but with a strange understanding. The crowd, sensing a shift, leaned in to hear more. For a moment, it seemed as if the fugitive didn't know whether to listen or to continue with his standoff. His eyes flicked between the officer and the royal guard, calculating. The officer took another step closer, but he kept a safe distance, his hands open and visible, showing that he posed no threat. He continued to speak, not with demands or orders, but with a sense of reason, almost as though he were speaking to an old friend. "I know you," the officer said. The words hung in the air, surprising everyone, especially the fugitive. His grip on the gun wavered for the briefest of moments. The fugitive blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "You know me?" he asked, his voice low, almost incredulous. It was a rare vulnerability, a crack in the otherwise hardened exterior he had so carefully built up over the years. The officer nodded slowly, a hint of recognition in his eyes. "Yes, I do. I've been following your case for a long time," the officer said, his voice steady and calm, filled with a depth of knowledge that seemed to surprise even the royal guard. "I know what's led you to this moment. I know your story." For a moment, the fugitive's expression softened, and the tension in the air seemed to loosen, just slightly. The royal guard, who had been prepared for anything, watched closely but didn't make a move. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a conversation, a delicate attempt to reach the man standing in front of him, caught in a moment of desperation. The officer didn't immediately try to convince the fugitive to surrender. Instead, he seemed to be trying to connect with him on a human level, a level the fugitive may have long forgotten in his flight from justice. The officer spoke gently, recounting parts of the fugitive's past, details the fugitive hadn't expected anyone to know. The officer mentioned the fugitive's family, his life before he became a wanted criminal. "You don't have to end it this way," the officer said softly, his eyes filled with empathy. "There is still a chance for you, but you have to put down the weapon." The crowd was completely silent now, watching intently as the officer's words seemed to sink in. The royal guard remained still, almost as if he were waiting for the officer to continue. Every moment was crucial. No one moved, It was as if the entire city had forgotten how to breathe. The fugitive's gaze flickered from the officer's face to his weapon, his finger still pressed against the trigger. The officer continued to speak, trying to reach something deep inside the fugitive, something that might make him rethink his desperate position. You don't have to be the person the world believes you are. You're not beyond redemption. It was clear now that the officer wasn't just trying to prevent violence. He was trying to save the fugitive from himself. The word hung heavy in the air. The scene had changed from one of potential violence to something more profound. An attempt to stop a man from making a decision he might regret for the rest of his life. The street felt suspended in time, as the officer's words seemed to wrap around the fugitive, offering him something more than just an escape from the guards. It was a chance for redemption, a lifeline thrown into a sea of desperation. Would the fugitive take it? The fugitive stood there, his hand still gripping the gun, but something had shifted in him. The weight of the officer's words seemed to settle over him like a heavy cloak. His eyes, once sharp and filled with anger and fear, softened just a little. For a moment, he looked like a man torn between two worlds, one where he was a fugitive, living in the shadows and running from his past, and another where he could walk away from this, where he might still have a chance at something else. The officer's calm demeanor, his understanding of the fugitive's pain, seemed to make the choice more difficult. The fugitive had been on the run for so long that it had become a part of him. He didn't remember what it felt like to not be hunted, to not be feared. It had become his reality, his identity. And now, in front of him, was a man offering him an escape from that life, offering him something he hadn't even considered, a second chance. For a brief moment, the fugitive's fingers loosened on the gun's handle. He didn't lower the weapon, but he didn't hold it as tightly either. The officer's words had made him think, for the first time in a long while, about what had brought him here. He hadn't just been running from the law. He had been running from himself, from the choices he had made, from the mistakes that had led him to this point. His mind raced as he remembered the days before he'd become a criminal, the days when he had a family, when he had hope for a future. But the life he had chosen had slowly eroded all of that. The fugitive had become a man who lived in the shadows, in fear, and in a constant state of survival. His existence had become one of bitterness and resentment, and the gun in his hand had become his only means of control. The thought of surrendering, of letting go of that control, felt foreign to him. It was a terrifying thought. Yet, the officer was right. He didn't have to continue down this path. He didn't have to be the person the world believed him to be. He wasn't beyond redemption. The officer had given him a glimpse of something he hadn't considered in years. The possibility of a different life, a life without constant fear and running. It was a choice, a difficult one, but it was there. The royal guard, still standing at a distance, watched the exchange between the officer and the fugitive with a sense of disbelief. He had been prepared for violence, for the fugitive to make a desperate move, but this was something he hadn't anticipated. The officer was doing something that seemed almost impossible. He was reaching the fugitive, getting through to him when no one else had been able to. The guard wondered, for a fleeting moment, if he had missed an opportunity to do the same. But now wasn't the time for second-guessing. The fugitive's face tightened, the inner battle clearly raging inside him. He glanced at the crowd that had gathered, their eyes full of curiosity and fear, and then back at the officer, who was standing there, waiting. The guard remained silent, his hand still near his sword, but not drawing it. He, too, was waiting. It was then that the fugitive made a move. His hand, which had been trembling ever so slightly, began to lower the gun. His fingers, stiff from holding the weapon for so long, released their grip, and the gun fell to the ground with a soft thud. The crowd collectively exhaled, though no one dared to make a sound. It was a small gesture, but it was one that spoke volumes. The fugitive had made his choice. For the first time in a long time, he had chosen something other than survival. He had chosen to step away from the path of violence, to take the first step toward redemption. The officer's words had reached him in a way that nothing else had. The man who had once been driven by fear and anger now stood before them, no longer holding onto his weapon, but holding onto a fragile hope for the future. The royal guard finally took a step forward, his expression unreadable. The situation wasn't over yet, but the moment of violence had passed. It was now a moment of potential, a chance for the fugitive to begin a new chapter. Whether he would take that chance was still uncertain, but for now, the gun was on the ground, and the first step had been taken. The fugitive stood there, his eyes focused on the gun that lay on the ground, the symbol of his past choices. It felt strange to him, seeing it there, discarded like an object of no more value. His heart was still racing, but in that moment, a sense of relief washed over him. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long seemed to lift, even if just a little. He hadn't realized how much the constant running, the hiding, the fear, had drained him. Now, for the first time in ages, he felt something different. He wasn't sure what it was, hope, maybe, or the first flicker of peace, but it was enough to make him take a deep breath. The officer, seeing the fugitive surrender, didn't rush toward him. He stood still, allowing the man the space he needed. There was no celebration, no immediate victory. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the choice the fugitive had made. The officer's calm presence was reassuring, offering an unspoken understanding that there would be no judgment. This was simply the beginning of a new chapter, and it was up to the fugitive to take it. The royal guard, who had been watching silently from the sidelines, took a few steps forward, his eyes never leaving the fugitive. He had witnessed countless situations like this before, but something about this moment felt different. The fugitive, the man who had once been feared and hunted, was now standing here, choosing a different path. There was something almost human about it, something raw and vulnerable that the guard hadn't expected to see. The crowd, too, was watching intently. The tension had not entirely disappeared, but the worst had passed. There were whispers among the onlookers, people exchanging looks, unsure of what would happen next. Would the fugitive try to escape again? Would the guards take him away immediately? But as they watched, it became clear that the situation had shifted. The fugitive had surrendered, not out of weakness, but because, for once, he was willing to face his actions. The officer moved slowly toward the fugitive, not with the urgency of someone about to capture a criminal, but with the gentleness of someone guiding a person who had been lost. He extended a hand, not to grab, but to offer support. "You don't have to run anymore," the officer said, his voice soft, but strong. "You've made the right choice. This is where things can change." The fugitive's eyes flickered to the officer's hand, and for a moment, he hesitated. He had been on the run for so long, trusting no one, relying only on his own instincts. But in this moment, something in the officer's demeanor made him feel that maybe, just maybe, he could trust again. Slowly, almost tentatively, the fugitive took a step forward. His hands, which had once been poised to fight, were now open, vulnerable. The royal guard, still standing to the side, observed the moment quietly. He had always been taught to protect, to uphold the law, but there was something about seeing the fugitive's willingness to give up his weapon and face the consequences of his actions that struck him. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were no cheers or accolades, but it was a quiet, powerful kind of victory. The kind that came not from force, but from the simple act of choosing to stop running, to stop fighting, and to face the truth. The fugitive's breathing steadied as he moved closer to the officer, his steps slow but deliberate. It was the first step towards something that felt more like freedom than the fear he had carried with him for so long. He wasn't sure what would come next, whether he would be arrested, tried, or given a chance at redemption. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was trapped. The officer's hand remained steady, a silent promise that whatever happened next, the fugitive wasn't alone anymore. The royal guard, who had once been prepared for a confrontation, now stood in quiet understanding, knowing that this situation had come to a peaceful resolution, one that neither side had expected, but that both were now willing to accept. The crowd, once filled with fear and uncertainty, began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. But the real change was happening quietly between the fugitive and the officer. No one knew exactly how this story would unfold, but in that brief moment, the fugitive had made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. The fugitive's steps were slow, almost tentative, as he followed the officer toward the awaiting royal guards. His mind was racing with thoughts of what would happen next. For so long, he had lived in a world where every move he made was calculated, every corner turned with caution, every breath taken in fear of discovery. But now he was walking into the unknown, leaving behind a life he had known for so long. The sense of uncertainty was almost overwhelming, but there was something else there too, something he hadn't felt in years. It was hope, flickering quietly in the back of his mind. The royal guard, still standing by, watched carefully as the fugitive was escorted toward the group of guards. His face was calm, but his eyes spoke volumes. He had seen many criminals in his time, but this was different. This wasn't the typical capture. There was a quiet dignity in the way the fugitive had surrendered, and it made the guard question the black and white nature of the law he had always upheld. Was justice truly about punishment, or could it sometimes be about offering second chances? The officer, sensing the moment was delicate, continued to guide the fugitive with quiet words of reassurance. "It's not too late," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You've taken the first step. That's more than most people would do." The fugitive looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. For so long, he had been consumed by anger and fear, but now he was faced with an unfamiliar choice, one that had the potential to change everything. The officer's words, though simple, carried weight, and the fugitive found himself considering them in a way he hadn't thought possible. The royal guards who stood in formation around them were silent, watching the scene unfold before them. The entire exchange had unfolded so quickly that they weren't sure what to make of it. They had expected a violent confrontation, or perhaps even an escape attempt. But instead, they saw a man who had laid down his weapon, a man who had chosen to surrender willingly without a fight. There was a sense of relief among them, relief that the situation had not escalated further, but also a quiet respect for the fugitive's choice. As they walked toward the royal palace, the crowd that had gathered in the street began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied. The hustle and bustle of the marketplace slowly returned to normal, but the event would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Some would speak of it in hushed tones, while others would wonder how the fugitive had come to make the decision to surrender. They had seen the transformation in front of them, the raw vulnerability of a man who had once been seen as nothing more than a criminal, now standing in front of them with the possibility of redemption. The royal guards finally reached the gates of the palace, and the officer led the fugitive inside. The grand stone walls loomed above them, silent witnesses to the passing of time and to the story unfolding within their walls. The fugitive's gaze drifted up to the towering structure, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider. There was no judgment in the officer's eyes, no disdain in the guard's gazes. For the first time, he felt as if he belonged somewhere. The officer gave a slight nod to the royal guards who stood at attention. "Take him inside," he said quietly. "We'll make sure he gets a fair trial." As the fugitive was led deeper into the palace, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. Fear still lingered in the back of his mind, but now there was also a sense of peace. He didn't know what would happen next, but the future no longer felt as terrifying as it once had. He had made a choice, and now he would face the consequences, whatever they may be. As the palace doors closed behind him, the crowd outside began to dissipate, the whispers dying down. The day's events would be remembered by those who had witnessed them, but for the fugitive, it was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, and he would have to prove himself, but he had taken the first step, and sometimes that was all it took to change the course of a life. Days passed after the fugitive was taken into custody, and the city's life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The whispers that had started in the street when the confrontation had occurred continued to spread. People talked about the man who had been wanted for so long, the man who had eluded capture for months, only to surrender in the middle of the bustling marketplace. They spoke about the officer who had stepped in, offering the fugitive a chance for redemption, and how the royal guard had been ready for a confrontation that never came. It was a story that captivated the people, a story of choices, of second chances, and of what it meant to be truly free. Inside the royal palace, the fugitive's future was being decided. The officer who had intervened was present, speaking on his behalf. The fugitive had been given a fair trial, as the officer had promised, and while the royal authorities were still uncertain about his ultimate fate, there was a growing sense of understanding within the palace walls. No one could deny the fugitive's past, nor could they ignore the gravity of his actions, but the officer had made a compelling case for his redemption. The fugitive's decision to surrender, the way he had chosen to lay down his weapon without a fight, showed that there was more to him than just the criminal history he carried. The royal authorities deliberated for several days, discussing the best course of action. They knew they couldn't simply ignore the fugitive's past. His actions had consequences, and those who had been harmed by him deserved justice. But there was also something undeniable about the choice he had made, something that set him apart from others who had followed a similar path. It was a difficult balance to strike. Justice versus mercy, punishment versus rehabilitation. But in the end, the officer's influence proved pivotal. The fugitive sat in a small, quiet room within the palace, awaiting the decision that would shape his future. He had never been in a place like this before, and the quiet solitude of the room felt foreign to him. It was strange to think that only a few days ago he had been running, desperate to avoid capture, and now he was sitting in a place where decisions about his life were being made. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't consumed by fear. His mind wandered back to the officer's words, the simple promise that things could still change. The officer had given him a chance to prove himself, and now it was up to him to follow through. When the officer finally entered the room, the fugitive stood up, his heart pounding. The officer's face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that the fugitive couldn't quite place. The silence between them stretched out, thick with anticipation. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the officer spoke. "You've been given a chance," the officer said, his voice steady. "But the road ahead won't be easy. You've made the first step, but you'll need to prove yourself. You'll work alongside the royal guards, help protect the city, and show that you're more than the man you were." The fugitive's heart raced, but it wasn't with fear this time. It was with something new, determination. He had been given a chance to start over, to rebuild his life, and he wasn't going to waste it. He nodded silently, understanding the weight of the officer's words. There was still much to prove, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose again. The officer gave him a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken promise between them. As the fugitive was led out of the room, he glanced out the window and looked at the palace grounds. The city stretched out before him, full of life and possibility. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't running anymore. He was standing at the beginning of something new, and the road ahead, though uncertain, held the potential for change. The story of the fugitive's surrender became a legend in the city. People spoke of it for years, not just as a tale of justice, but as a reminder of the power of choice, of second chances, and of the possibility for redemption. The officer's intervention had changed everything, but it was the fugitive's willingness to step away from the life he had known that truly made the difference. His journey had only just begun, but he had taken the first step toward a future that no one, not even he, could have predicted.